That's me in 1986. Never get a presentation off without a bit of sympathy from the crowd for the child moment. That's me in the corner. At the time, there's a computer in the background in that picture, so it's not very good representation, but I was obsessed with a game on the ZX Spectrum called 180. Is anybody old enough, I know you are, Michael, to remember that particular thing? It came with a quirk. It spoke. This was 8-bit audio, which you had to rattle ones and zeros out to get a thing to speak, and it sort of said 180 and things like that. Sorry for the feedback there. And I couldn't figure out how it did that, so I got obsessed with audio for quite a while. And around about the same time, I was equally obsessed with teletext, at which point in 1987, a genuine screenshot, you could phone up and speak to the teletext, and you could say things like, if you knew the code, 200 for sport, 300 for news, and such like, and ran up a £100 phone bill for my parents trying to figure out and navigate the system and make sure it worked properly. But it did, and it was really good, and I've had a lifetime obsession with things like this until something happened around about 7 or 8 years ago, and I get in so much trouble for using this slide, but I'm never going to stop doing it. I'm going to rephrase this because this is where I get in trouble. I broke wind on my own in my own house, and Siri played me Hotel California by the Eagles. To this day, I will not stop in the world of voice and conversation until I figure out how that happened. Currently, I'm applying some of the things I've learned down the years in analysing audio to track the progress of diabetic foot disease, which is my current stealth project at Warrical, where I make a living at the moment, warrical.com if you're interested. And some of the things actually coming from quite a trivial joke, analysing audio, have a practical use. This is my life in voice. But then around about the same time, and this is where it starts to coalesce around something useful, I worked for a place called Skyscanner, where we tried to do things a little bit differently and keep ahead of emerging technology. But our goal was to book a flight, as easy it was at the time to buy a book, the Amazon objective, essentially. But at the time, as we found, apps which we thought were the thing to do were difficult. Most people don't download them. If you didn't know, 2/3 of people don't ever download a new app in a year. Right through to the fact that 95% of people bin apps they do download after 3 months. And even in the world of travel, it's harder. Jeff mentioned assistants for travel earlier on, and how they're still not very good, and there's a hell of a lot of progress in the last 7 or 8 years. People don't use apps, so there has to be something else they will use to try and help them. So we thought, there's a challenge that we can try and get into. This is in 2012, just to date this a little bit. 3 apps that look of their time. The one on the far right is Windows 8, which we worked with Microsoft to produce. You will notice there's a microphone in the corner. So we took a punt that we could make something that got people more engaged with the app and stuck to it in such a way they wouldn't get rid of it within the 3-month window I talk about. And it worked. But at the time, the industry was so nascent, we had to build the entire natural language processing stack. And bear in mind, the app ran in 33 languages. So we had to build the stack to produce the results of, I want to go to Poland, or I want to go to London, or whatever it might be as a phrase. But it worked, and the stickiness of that app compared to iOS and Android at the time, was off the charts. So we thought we were onto something. And the more we looked at it, and this slide's from 2015, but it's deliberate, at the time, people spent their time in conversations. Their idle time and their work time, by and large, were spent in conversational apps, which means their mental model is almost always on the device about a conversation of one kind or another. Whether you measure it by downloads or sessions, it didn't matter. And at the time, and again, this is dated deliberately, WeChat at the time had 650 million users chatting for commerce, 1/3 of whom, roughly, were registered to buy things. Those numbers are double that now, in both respects, both percentage and aggregate total. So there was something there. So we thought we'd give it a go, and I always try and pull out quotes. There's going to be 2 or 3 as we traverse this. And this was the way we thought about it. If apps are in the business of selling distraction, which they were at the time, those of us who played things like Angry Birds and lost the evening to it, bots would buy time back. Apps sell it, we buy it back again. And that's essentially the entire business plan of what we were doing at Skyscanner. So we thought, how do we translate that into function? Because at heart, I'm a product manager. It's a phrase, because you know what you want. When you go into an app 2/3 of people who used the Skyscanner app knew what they wanted. It's interesting that a third didn't. We had to cater for that another way. 2/3 knew exactly what they wanted. They had a budget. Most of them have an airline preference, so they can state it. So we thought, there's a phrase that we can get people to say, rather than the 8 or 9 steps it would take to do that in reality, to navigate an app, which is actually quite clumsy. And then we demonstrated this. That's me, and there's going to be some vanity pictures of me at conferences, doing this on an Amazon Echo in a similar setup to this, proving that at the time, something people didn't expect, you could speak to a speaker with that phrase that was just in your head and have it turn into a conversation about buying the flight, choosing the airline, and so on, and it worked. That's good. Hence, the slides are the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? It took me a while to weave that in. So that's good. But then you start to think about complexity. It's easy to produce something that's in my head as a product manager, but there are millions of people who do different things. I'll not rattle through these, but there are so many combinations of things that happen. I'll tell the anecdote that the King of Siam gets £5 off every flight in the world to this day in the airline booking system. And there's many of these things. There's 100,000 taxes to get over that people need when they book. Purely in saying, I'm going from here to there, in the airline systems, there are 2 and a bit million city-to-city combinations, London to Edinburgh, Edinburgh to London, and so on, that you have to get over. And it's cumbersome in the way at the time in 2015, and it's not much different now, how these entities are taken out of a phrase to understand what the person wants to do. It's hard. And then you start to think a bit more systematically, as you do as a developer, to try and navigate, or even a UX designer, how somebody would go through that journey. So from the basic steps of information that you have to get as a minimum, and then start to think a little bit more like a state machine, where people start to have different ways they can come in and out based on the information they've already given and the things that still need to be found. You end up something like that, which isn't very nice. I can happily share you the full-blown version of that so you can read it. It's dated, so it doesn't matter anymore. But it got a bit out of hand very quickly, starting to piece together the experience, and that's a bad thing. And at the time, 2016, just going on a little bit, Dan Grover, who was a product manager for WeChat at the time in 2016 and knew this better than anyone, warned us all, bots won't replace apps, better apps will replace apps. And fundamentally, that's still the case. We should have listened. Dan used to talk about pizza ordering in China and how people went from thinking that you could go through the steps I've talked about and replace clicks with phrases. Actually, the 9 steps I was thinking about replacing in a flight search were about 75, depending what the location was and the dates you selected. There's a muscle memory that people were happy with. So there's a better way to do that in an app than take the app out of the process altogether. We should have listened to that. And this is how it works in practice. So if you were saying to somebody a date or a day of the week or tomorrow, these things are okay. They're reasonably well understood, although in 2015 they weren't. But then you get to an entity like 1 week later or the next day. The next day from what has to be connected to something else, otherwise the system doesn't understand it. Thanksgiving and Christmas, do you want to travel on those days or buy those days? So there's actually complexity you don't think about when people are in the mental model of choosing a flight date, for example. What is it they actually wanted? Then you get into our life at the time, the regulations of travel, where you have to explain certain things to people, small print. Now, if you listen to the radio, these things are read at treble speed to make sure people don't listen to them. I'm sure you've heard people selling insurance and things like that on radio. They rattle out the small print at the end. You're not allowed to do that in travel, especially if it's personal to you and the quote you had. That's bad. Then you get to things like conversations where you're actually trying to get a Ryanair flight and they take a minute to give you a price because they're like that. And that's bad. It's ugly. These things become ugly very quickly, despite very plausible routes at the start of the product. But, and this is going to be the theme from now on, I hope, we gave it a go anyway. And the exposure we got, both as a company in the travel industry, as a company, you might want to work for, and generally as a reputation, to try things was great. And we're very glad we did it. And it's still, to this day, seen as something crucial on the path of that company to IPO and exit. And we got unlocked more things as we did it. So this is Cortana, where we ended up doing an integration deep into Cortana and Bing at the time, which is more about functional use of what you're doing. So we exposed things like you were searching for a flight. Here's the pattern where you might want to actually book it, and things like that that are useful to your actual travel journey. Good, very good. Oh, excuse me. Then we saw the reviews as we start to do these things. Don't waste your time, not worth it. Nightmare, not the sort of thing you want to hear as a product manager. These are bad. And then we started to look at the ecosystem. And at this time, I migrated to work for Amazon. Other people were seeing the same things for very simple functionality, such as playing the radio. So how can playing the radio produce 1-star reviews? But it does, routinely. There's thousands of them. And yet, the BBC, despite these bad reviews, have sticky users. So there is something in this that if you get the right product, at the time, again, I'm dating these slides deliberately because this is when I crossed paths with them, but 265 million people listened to a BBC stream in about a year and a half from launch, 18 million news summaries, which are flash briefings for those who know the term. And then people start to get into the mental model of saying, right, there's a speaker there, I'm going to ask for the radio, I'm going to ask for the content that's in my head at the time, or even open the BBC if they're in the model of an app and having to open to get it. So it's no surprise to me that if you think about the things that will work on voice and chat interface, where travel search possibly didn't, audio on a speaker kind of instinctively makes sense, and it's a surprise nobody really thought of that way further back, and that the main platforms didn't try to enable it earlier for the publishers of that content. But it's good that people do have that, because it gives us something to work with on where people do these things. But it started to produce some questions in the trade, mostly behind the scenes. If you're a developer, are you developing a skill or telling us what Amazon wants? And I'm picking on Amazon a little bit here, but Google kind of the same. Who's the gatekeeper for what Alexa does and says? Because everything passes through the assistant. Is the user talking to the skill, in that case the BBC, or Amazon? And it produces strange results. So BBC Schedule has a thing called the Radio 1 Dance Party at the weekend. One of the most listened to things on BBC Sounds as an app. Nobody asked for Radio 1 Dance Party at all. In the time that they launched the scale, the first 18 months, Dance Party or Radio 1 Dance Party. Everybody asked for Annie Mac because it's her show. So the things people are asking for weren't recognized by the system. So you had to start supplying different data to get the result people wanted. So then you get into more ethical questions, because the BBC is a public broadcaster. Users are asking for content, not brands. How do the brands attribute themselves? Because people complain if you say, we are the BBC, before the content starts. How does the broadcaster know who's listening if there's a gatekeeper in the middle? And will anyone ever ask the BBC something? Well, if you live in a different part of the UK, you have a choice. If you live in Northern Ireland in particular, and possibly Southern Ireland, if you say play Radio 1 as a phrase, there is a choice to make, because in those domains, Radio 1 could be RTE or it could be BBC, but to the people that listen to it, it's Radio 1. Who makes the choice? The assistant, in a black box, depending on their preference at the time and what they know about you. The broadcasters have no control over that. You can teach people to say, as happens in these things, open RTE Radio 1, which forces people down a road they're not familiar with, or you trust through, or you regulate to make sure a certain thing happens. Shouldn't need to happen. Spend time actually opening these things out to let users learn and choose a preference. But instead, the platforms start to go into things like voice-enabling coffee makers and toasters and microwaves and things that are of no use to anyone, rather than enabling the things that people actually ask for day to day. And I'm going to be picky on that because it's not right. It's ugly. It's an ugly way to develop an ecosystem for people who actually want to do things that people are asking for. The unpredictability of voice, driven by these black boxes that I mentioned and where assistants make the decisions, have some interesting side effects. This is one from Skyscanner, which some of you will have seen before. Where would you like to go? I want big, strong men and muscle bears. That person bought a flight to Cleveland. I've never understood it in my life how that happened, but they did. But that's good, because somebody came to an interface and got what they wanted. Sometimes you just trust serendipity and it worked. Ask for a flight. Somebody said the moon. We could never get Alexa to respond with anything other than you're going on July the 12th. They didn't know either why that happened, and both sides had to hack something out of it. That's bad, because even the platform doesn't understand why it's happening. How, as a developer, publisher, trying the system, are you meant to get over that? Welcome back, and then you get into human intuition, because people are idiots, generally. What are you wearing was one of the first things people asked our bot when we put it out, and you can't do anything about that other than be prepared for it, but we weren't at the time. That's ugly, and people are ugly in the things they say to systems, and suddenly you have to think about what people are going to do. This is my quote that I use all the time. I've been using it since 2015 in a thing I'm about to show you. Nobody knows what they're doing with voice, conversation, or AI yet. Don't bother building anything unless you're willing to try again shortly after. I live and die by that phrase because it's still true, and it's not a bad thing. I persuaded the Apps World conference in London to hold a track called Bot World, and then stood on stage at Bot World telling everybody not to bother. And it went down like a lead balloon. But I still think it was the right thing to do. But as always, being hopeful and a hypocrite, I was on stage a year later working for Amazon telling everyone that voice was brilliant and you should do it, regardless of the risks. And then even more of a hypocrite, standing on stage to developers telling them how to build a cat fact skill in 5 minutes, which nobody's ever going to use. And there were 350 of them in the store at the time, but that's what the industry does to try and get people interested. And that's okay, as long as you tell them at the same time it might not work, and they can be okay with that. It's bad in a way that the hypocrisy is there, but fair enough, we get over it, because things start to happen in the industry. And as a partial advisor investor and still doing a few of these things, in 2015, 2 of us were hacking these things together in Skyscanner as a part-time enterprise. Suddenly, a year later, we had 10 people full-time employed on it, and that's great. We had a complete team becoming a department over time. And then you get a year later than that, when I drifted to Amazon, the team I had that built things with people was 21 strong in Europe alone, and they were just enabling others to do it. So the ecosystem beyond that was probably hundreds of times bigger than that. Then you get to even bigger things, that going back to Skyscanner for a little while to develop an interface for service management and service design in flights. We had dozens of people working on it. We had 6 squads all of a sudden because the thing had snowballed into actual problems for people. And then even bigger, when you get to the BBC in 2019, where I tried to build a department to create an assistant, we had 125 doing the same things in a rolling path. So the industry gets bigger all the time. Kane down there will tell you every week there's been money put into something. Every week a VC invests in voice, conversation, or natural language technology, and that's a good thing, and it's because people have learned to give it a go and fail if they have to, and that's good. Every product should be about that, and this is where I'm a bit of a cheerleader for it, but it'll never change. Because back in 2015, that happened, and I put a speaker in front of people who'd never used one before and challenged them to do something without telling them how to do it, and that was the reaction. I've used this slide every week pretty much for about 5 years, and I'll live and die by it, but these are natural reactions for people who at the time didn't know they were being photographed. Using a voice service that worked, and it was minimal, but it worked. And I think everybody should try to achieve that to this day. Even if they get it wrong the first 2 or 3 times, be prepared for 1-star reviews saying you are awful. That is my speech. I hope it was interesting and a bit of fun. I look forward to all the deep tech from other people later on in the conference. Here for a chat if you want one. Other than that, thank you very much.